Okay, let's get started. I'm Dan Rundy. I hold the Schreier Chair here. We're having a conversation. It's a real privilege and an honor to co-host this with my friend and colleague, Kath Hicks, who's our Senior Vice President, as well as the Director of our International Security Program. There's going to be a national security strategy written sometime in the very near future. And CSIS is a bipartisan institution. We're about solutions and we're about ideas and always trying to help, put helpful ideas on the table and be constructive. So we thought, well, we know there's something going on, and we knew that if we'd done this before. I think we did this in the last time 4 years ago. Kath and I did this together. And so we said, well, what are the sorts of things you'd want to see in a national security strategy? What's changed in the last several years? What are the sorts of things we expect, or what are some things we'd like to, that may be different from in the past, and what are some things that need to be thought about and kept in mind? And we've got a very distinguished set of panelists and thoughtful people to do this. So, you have introduced Kath Hicks. There's Christine Wormuth. You were the Undersecretary. But you've got a new life. I'm going to do an infomercial for you. You've got a new life. What's your new life?
Yes, I'm now at the Atlantic Council, and we have started a new Center on Resilience, which is sort of the idea of looking at, there's so much turbulence in the world, we can't prevent all of it, so how do we apply resilient strategies to try to manage through change and be able to bounce back from everything coming at us?
Well, we're really grateful you'd come down the street all the way from the Atlantic Council to be with us. Thank you, and we love the Atlantic Council. It's great. Ambassador Tony Wayne, thanks for being here. You're the former ambassador to Mexico. You're the former ambassador to Argentina. You were the coordinator for all assistance in Afghanistan. You were assistant secretary for economic affairs at the State Department. You had a great career in the foreign service over many decades, and you're also a senior advisor here at CSIS. So I thought we have some really smart and thoughtful people to help us unpack this, and I know there's a really smart and thoughtful audience here to also help us with this as well. So I think, why don't we just start? And so Kath, if you were writing a national security strategy, what are the sort of things you'd want to see in the document?
Well, let me say first that I think if I were writing a national security strategy, the number one issue you always look to is what is it that the president's seeking to achieve? And you have to start from there. So I'm happy to wax momentarily on the things I think are important, but what I think are important matters far less than what is it that the administration wants to set out as its priorities. Because the audience for the national security strategy, there are multiple audiences, but certainly there is the U.S. government itself and those who have to execute whatever it is that the president lays out that he wants. But allies, partners, the American public, and even potential adversaries are looking for this document to help them understand the world and how the U.S. sees itself. So what I would want to see is an articulation, as we have had for the past, I went back, there were, as mentioned to you earlier, 16 national security strategies that have been developed since the requirement for a national security strategy was set in law in 1986. There's remarkable consistency from Reagan to Bush 1 to Clinton to Bush 2 to Obama, actually, regarding this idea of the U.S. having a leadership role in the world. And that is the number one thing that I would want to see articulated, which is a recognition that we live in a global community, however it's defined or however it's articulated. And that for the U.S. to prosper and its citizens to achieve their interests, that we have to stay engaged in the world. After that point, it gets a lot more complicated administration to administration in terms of how they articulate it, and there certainly are shifts. But laying out that that is a primary goal of our national security strategy and that we have enduring interests that are common across those administrations, the security of our citizens, the recognition of alliances and the security commitments we've made to our allies, the importance of our prosperity at home and how well linked that is or thoroughly linked that is to the global community and prosperity globally, I think is very important. I will say I think that the what I would term ultimately unfortunate op-ed written by the National Security Advisor McMaster and key economic advisor Cohn, they came out in the Wall Street Journal just after the president returned from his major trip overseas. Actually, if you read it carefully, carries many of those themes through. And then it sort of takes a sharp turn. And I don't know if somebody grabbed the pen and ad-libbed an ending that had more to do about a transactional relationship and the idea of when our interests align with others, we may work with them on overseas issues. which leaves sort of an ellipse thought to the reader that in other instances, maybe alliances don't mean as much because we're so transactional. I think that's very unfortunate. And I'm hoping the national security strategy is an opportunity to reset from an op-ed like that again, I think started down the right path and then seemed to take an odd turn. But if that's the turn that the president intends to articulate, better for it to be an accurate strategy than one that is misleading to his actual priorities. So I think I'll stop there.
Thanks. Christine, if you were writing a national security strategy, what would you want to see in it? Let's be maybe agnostic about who sits who's the occupant of the Oval Office. There's some continuity. This is Kath was talking about across these 16 strategies. What are some of the things you'd want to see in it, regardless of who's the occupant in the White House at any time?
Well, I think Kath laid out a lot of it. I guess I would add a couple of other sort of broad categories. One, I think in addition to sort of laying out what our objectives are, what our national interests are, what our values are, I think the national security strategy is an opportunity to identify what do we see as the key challenges or threats to those interests, and what are the potential opportunities. Where can we try to do good things in the world as a nation. I also think often, not always, but often national security strategies are a place where the administration lays out its philosophy to the use of force, which hopefully is tied again back to national interests. I think that's a useful thing to have in national security strategy, so I hope this new administration will take advantage of that. And I think something else that I would encourage the administration to do in the NSS, which again is not something that all previous administrations has done well, is to try to articulate a sense of priorities. There's so many challenges out there. Clearly we have challenges here at home. We can't do everything all of the time, and I think a strategy will be probably more effective, more sustainable, and more realistic if it's able to really sort of articulate what are we prioritizing and where, by implication, may we be taking risk or de-emphasizing. And I think there were a couple of documents in the Obama administration where we did that pretty well, in particular the Defense Strategic Guidance document that came out that basically unveiled the rebalance to Asia Pacific, and I hope that trend towards more prioritization continues.
So Tony, you've participated in other national security strategy processes, preparation processes. I know Kath and Christine have as well. What would you want to see in this document? What are some of the themes that you'd hope to see in this strategy?
Well, I think there are a couple of very important value added that come out of a national security strategy. One is you bring the whole team together and you rally around a conception of what the world looks like, what the risks are, what tools you have available, what your objectives are, how you're going to get there. You can see the value of having this in the recent budget testimonies on the Hill, where unsuccessfully people tried to defend proposed budget cuts, and they weren't able to explain that on the basis of a strategy or a risk assessment or a set of objectives.
This current administration, so there's specific budget cuts for this administration, saying how is that linked to a strategy?
So this administration came in and proposed a number of very significant draconian cuts in a number of areas, but there was no strategy, no rationale to explain how this tied into our national interests, how this tied into the threats in the world, what we were going to use the remaining money for to address those threats, and why certain cuts had been made based on that assessment of our national interests and objectives. So this strategy will actually allow them to formulate a common position and be able to enunciate why they might need more resources here or less resources there. Now, people will still have to be convinced, but that's a valuable part of it. The other, I think, real value of this process is that you can talk through the lessons learned of the past several decades by a whole series of administrations and officials as to what's worked best and what hasn't worked. And we can talk about that in more detail later on, all of us. But there are a number of clear lessons. The basic sort of big lesson, as I've seen it, and you've seen this come out in the discussions, is that we need to take what's often called a whole of government approach. It doesn't really mean all of government, but that you have all the tools available that could come from various parts of the government, the civilian and military part of it, a big part, but not all of it, and see what tools you have available to make sure you have teams working across the U.S. government to address your common needs, and try to apply that as best as possible. And as we can talk about a little bit later, in some places we've done pretty well, in other places it's still a work in process, and that work in process could be some of the reforms that could come in the months and years ahead.
So let me ask the three of you, do people, so Tony talked a little bit, Ambassador Wayne talked a little bit about this, which is about there's some use from the Congress on this, but who reads this thing? Do people actually read this thing? And seriously, and then B, how does it feed into other government processes, if at all? It's supposed to be mandated on an annual basis, but I count 31 years, and we've done it 16 times, so I think most administrations, I think the Clinton administration has done the best job of producing many national security strategies. The Bush administrations did 2, and the Obama administration did 2. So do people really read this stuff? Does it really matter? And is it actually plug into actual other kinds of bureaucratic processes? Kath?
Fundamentally, the answer is yes. People read it. It does matter. But it is not at all unusual for action to follow in the national security realm that does not align to the strategy. That can happen because the context changes. It can happen because the budget changes. It can happen because you didn't write a good strategy, and it can happen because nobody cares what was in the strategy. So you're most successful when the strategy is really owned, is something Christina and I have talked a lot about in other contexts, when the leadership really owns the strategy and it's theirs, and then you're most likely to see clean alignment from the top down in a hierarchical sense of not only action to, in direct response to the national security strategy, but in terms of bureaucratic alignment of documents to the national security strategy. So the more that the institutions understand and that allies, for instance, understand that the strategy reflects the intent of the leadership, the more likely it is to be followed and important. There are, of course, everyone in Washington likes to say how much strategies don't matter, and as somebody who's written lots of strategies, I take that as a given. And actually, Bob Gates, I think, has a quote in his book, Duty, like, I never read these things. But I also think it can be misleading. Like, if you're already so inside the system that he may have never read a national security strategy, but my guess is he could, off the top of his head, give you a sense of what a national security strategy is, because we're so a part of the system. I think the bigger question is, do those on the outside who are trying to maybe don't have a strong sense and are trying to gauge, which way the weather vane is pointing, can they get a sense from the NSS? And I think the answer to that is yes, and they look to it for that reason.
Christine?
If I could just add to that, I think particularly, frankly, because, President Trump, as a candidate, said a lot of different things about a lot of issues that are going to probably manifest in the national security strategy. And what he is, several of the positions he's taken at any given point as president have been, not always completely logically coherent. And certainly I know I see representatives from foreign governments at least once a week coming over, whether it was here when I was at CSIS or now at the Atlantic Council, saying, what does the administration really think about this? What are they really going to do about Pakistan? What are they really going to do? What do they really think about NATO? So I think that probably more than is typical, countries around the world, diplomatic corps here in the embassies, but also out in the ministries in other countries, are going to read this national security strategy because they are looking to it to try to read the tea leaves. And I think they are going to be interested to see how the national security strategy document tries to pull together and make sense of some of the different positions that have been taken. So I think it will be important in that way, in a way maybe that previous NSSs haven't been. I also want to underscore, I think it was Tony who made the point that even if not as many people read the document as you wish would, the process of developing that document is a very important intellectual and process team building exercise. It is a way to get the senior White House people and by extension senior cabinet folks in the executive branch on the same page in terms of what we're trying to do. And I think that is a very important contribution that the process makes, although the idea of doing it every year is insane.
Ambassador Wayne,
Strategy only lasts a year. It's not a good strategy.
Yeah. Ambassador Wayne, how is you were ambassador to Argentina and Mexico. How did you ever have conversations about national security strategy with counterparts on the ground in Mexico, Argentina, or Afghanistan? And then B, how is this document used, if at all, at the State Department?
Well, maybe taking off that latter point, what happens once you have a national security strategy is that you use it for budget documents, you use it for other planning documents. Each agency has their own version of this strategy, which they develop for various purposes, including the budget, each year. And those documents will reflect the main pillars of the strategy. It will evolve over time, and people will fill in more detail, which will allow them flexibility in applying their policy. And that it's more that indirect impact that you have in the agencies and then with other governments as this filters through the whole policy that you're actually implementing around the world. So it's a framework that people refer back to. But you don't pick it up and read it on a daily basis or a weekly basis. It informs you, and then you define more detailed sub-strategies, either on a regional basis, a country basis, or a thematic basis. Those will be filled out in other NSC processes and in various department processes.
Okay, I want to talk about Kath Hicks and I did a podcast this morning, and she used some terms that I don't think existed a couple of years ago. And it underlined for me that the threat environment, there are a series of continuing, ongoing threats in the world, but those threats are evolving, and they're actually changing, and it's a dynamic threat environment. So Kath, if you're looking at the threat environment, what are the things on the threat radar screen, and what's different than, say, 5 or 10 years ago that will probably be in this document?
I just want to underscore Christine's point about priorities, because for somebody like me asking them, but I could go for 4 hours probably on the threat environment. So I do think the key
You pay your
thing,
mortgage on that.
Right. Exactly right. I pay my mortgage on the threat environment. So this sort of the storming, norming, team building process is a lot about kind of culling through the many challenges and opportunities and trying to pull out the most important. So let me just focus on several. I'm probably going to skip something again, but on things that are significantly different. What prompted, I think, your comment right now is we're talking about ransomware, which of course is very much in the news today.
I'd never heard that term before. I mean, did that word exist 3 years ago?
Not that I know.
Probably not.
Right. It may have somewhere, but certainly not in the common lexicon. No. But I definitely think, the world of cyber and information, the information environment has long been a theme across multiple national security strategies and inside the national security community as a context builder in terms of speed of decision making, a series of opportunities that it opens up, the threat environment. We hear about it, for instance, we've heard about it for several years from Al-Qaeda to ISIS as a means by which ideology can spread that can harm our interests. It's also obviously a vehicle in theory that we can use to spread true news, if you will, or also American views about interests in the world. So I think that information environment is very important to continue to highlight. The cyber threat piece of it, again, has been a consistent theme, but I think grows exponentially in terms of its potential over time. I think to get to something I'll just set on the table and leave for Christine, I do think a lot of this will come back to this resiliency issue of there are many, many threats in the world. What is the balance going to be between, if you will, hard security and response to threat, and managing risk in a way that makes us feel like we can keep these challenges checked. They're existing, they're going to threaten us. There will be terrorist attacks, for instance. There will be cyber attacks. There will be health threat vectors, but that we have systems in place that make us resilient as a society to protect our interests. How resilient is the global economy from fluctuations, from single points of failure? things of that sort. I think that is a major, on the transnational threats, if you will, major issues. Climate is another. I expect that they will dodge climate entirely. I mean, it's possible they could come out and say something definitively about a view on climate. I think they are much more likely to sidestep it, but focus on energy and energy independence without speaking much to climate. And then on the nation state side, the biggest question mark is what they're going to say about Russia. I look forward to seeing what that is. I think there's no doubt in the minds of every national security analyst of any worth that I know that Russia is a declining power that is presenting quite a number of challenges as it is going through its own internal process of, corruption and decline, and it's nuclear powered, and that's a problem. And by the same, general token, but going the other direction, is this question of exactly what China's route forward is and what that means for U.S. prosperity and for U.S. security. So again, I could go all day, Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, but
It's a happy list. It's a very happy list.
It's a happy list. But you said we're going to talk about opportunities later.
I want to come back to opportunities, but I just, on the issue of, I'll pass, but Christine, thank you. So, okay, if you're thinking about threats, what are some of the threats, and maybe pick up some of the strings that Kathleen left for you?
Yeah, I think, some of the threats I think that this national security strategy and this administration are going to be likely to emphasize are terrorism is clearly going to be a big issue. And I think they'll probably deal with that, on the one hand, kind of in the away game context in terms of what they say about the counter-ISIS campaign, about what they say about Afghanistan, for example. But of course, also there's a domestic reflection of that. And I think you see, when you see people like Secretary Kelly, for example, over at the Department of Homeland Security, talking about border security or Homeland Security more generally, he is very animated by terrorism as being a very important threat driver. I think he's also very animated, something he's long been interested in, even when he was commander out at U.S. Southern Command, in looking at transnational criminal organizations, and potentially he has a big concern about the potential nexus between transnational criminal organizations, narco-traffickers, and terrorists, layered with potentially the possibility of weapons of mass destruction being brought in through those transnational criminal channels. I'm not sure that the intelligence community has seen strong indications of that at this point, but certainly it's a theoretical possibility, and that's something that Secretary Kelly is very focused on. And so I think what you're likely to see in terms of the document's treatment of Homeland Security, you're going to see probably a pretty tight connection to border security, illegal immigration, and again, a lot of the concern, I think, for this administration about illegal immigration is the possibility of, will jihadists, for example, use our refugee system to come in? That was presumably the animation behind their executive order with the travel ban. So I think that you're going to see probably fairly prominently. Then to Kath's point about cyber attacks are a huge concern for this administration, as they were, frankly, for the previous administration. So I would expect you'll see a pretty decent treatment of cyber vulnerabilities, the potential for cyber attacks on our infrastructure, particularly the electric grid. Some of you may have seen news reports just a couple of weeks ago about a malware program called Crash Override, which was used to attack the electric grid in Kyiv, Ukraine. But we're concerned about our own electrical grid and the potential vulnerabilities there. So I think you'll probably see this administration released their executive order on cybersecurity just about a month and a half ago. There was a lot of continuity, frankly, and a lot of building on what the Obama administration has done. But I think, you'll see there a lot of emphasis on assessing our vulnerabilities and beefing up our cyber defense capabilities. So those are some of the things I think you'll see. I'm not sure, while I certainly think resilient thinking is a crucial tool to try to address all of these challenges, I'm not sure, frankly, whether that's a concept that will get a lot of traction in this document. I haven't heard a lot of explicit conversation about that, so I would certainly like to think that that will be there, but I'm not necessarily sanguine at this point.
Okay, Tony, we think about threats. Let me do a PSA for myself, and that we had General Kelly several times before he was Secretary Kelly here at CSIS. and we did a report looking at the push factors from the Northern Triangle. Why were 75,000 young people showing up at our border in 2014, and looking at issues of not enough economic opportunity, weakness in citizen security, corruption. These are all things you can't solve with kinetic power, but the United States has a stake in doing that, and the U.S. Congress, in partnership with the Republican Congress and the Obama administration, put together an initiative to try and get at some of those push factors and those root causes. I know that Vice President Pence has continued to take on the leadership role that Vice President Biden had on these issues in the Northern Triangle. So I think this issue of gangs and transnational threats, Christine, that you're talking about, I think these aren't going away, and these are long-term problems. And the bumper sticker is we need a Plan Colombia. This is sort of the Plan Colombia for the Northern Triangle, if you put it that in shorthand terms. Tony, when you think about threats, what would you expect to see in this document?
Well, one, I think the theme of risk management is very important in this, and I hope it will be fully integrated. I expect it will be into this. Secondly, I hope there'll be a better treatment of the so-called soft power and the tools associated with that.
I pay my mortgage on that, so good.
Yes,
good. I'm
yes.
glad you referenced that, Tony.
And if you think about the debate and the discussion we've had in recent weeks, it's been former military officers, business leaders, faith leaders, NGOs, all talking about the value and the cost effectiveness of using these so-called soft powers, and the real costliness when you do have to use your hard power. It costs a lot and endangers a lot more people. So I hope we'll see integrated into this strategy the whole range of those tools that we have available, from traditional diplomacy and development through public diplomacy to economic sanctions, all of which we can use to help mitigate risk as we go forward. And they can be very effective, and we've seen that in certain instances. We're also going to see some areas, as I mentioned earlier, especially dealing with certain fragile states and conflict situations, where we haven't done as well as we should in using these soft power tools. And so I hope this national security strategy will identify that area as an area for further work of coming together and figuring out how we can do this. The other big area I hope we'll see highlighted is the value of allies and partners in doing this. And that is other governments, it's sometimes international organizations, and it's NGOs, and it's the private sector. And we need all of those partners in different situations, not in every situation, but we need to draw on them to help us deal with some of these challenges. You could see it in the meeting on Central America, the very worthwhile meeting in Florida last week, where the private sector was there, the regional banks were there, the World Bank was there, and that was a recognition that you need all these different tools and these different levers to help bring about change in countries that are suffering from organized crime, from the kind of social situations that lead people to want to flee, that we can't fix those by just being tougher at our borders with our line of defense at Homeland Security. Our Homeland Security begins in those other countries.
Okay, I want to just spend a minute more on threats. I want to talk about failed, weak, and failing states. I think we did a paper on a tale of two paths about the developing world. You've got 50 or 60 countries following the path of South Korea and Taiwan that are going to become middle-income countries, más o menos, just in broad brush terms. And then you got 30 very difficult, broken, complicated places, and they're going to be with us for a very, very long time. And they require diplomacy and development and security and a whole bunch of different levers working together, and they're very intractable, but they're also the sources of, they're accelerants of pandemics, they're places where terrorists train, or people get trafficked, or drugs are grown or processed, or militias are, criminal gangs flourish, people get up and leave in large numbers. There's all sorts of bad things happen in these ungoverned spaces and these fragile, weak, and broken states. I'm sure that this is on some of the writers' minds and thinking about this, because I'd like to hear from each of you about if you were thinking about this issue of fragile states or weak states or broken countries or whatever you want to call it. I'll be curious to see what they call this phenomenon. But there's lots of different technical terms for it. I could come up with some non-technical terms for it, but I won't here, because this is a family think tank. But I would just say there are some real serious problems, intractable problems. So I'd like to hear from each of you, because I know that is going to be on the minds of the writers. So Kath, let me start with you.
Well, I agree. I was hinting before, there's some that are very evident that would be hard to dodge. Syria, Iraq, theater, Yemen. And then there, as you say, there are many more areas, and Afghanistan, right? So I think it has to be taken on. The frame matters, but I think it will surround fragility or weakness, state weakness, governance problems. We, of course, already know that there has been a desire on the part of the administration as submitted in its budget to defund a lot of that programming. So I think that it will be very hard for the writers, again, to work through that. My guess is that they will have to speak more about international burden sharing, the sort of using taxpayer dollars wisely, those kinds of themes that are not inconsistent in and of themselves with themes that have been extant in U.S. national security strategy for some time. But they're going to have to really, there's not going to be sort of on the one hand, on the other hand, there's really just the one hand, which is these are not areas we choose to invest ourselves in through federal tax dollars at the moment. So presumably, hopefully that one way they circle that is talking more about the role of the private sector, the role of philanthropy, the role of international partners and international organizations. And, maybe it will also drive reform, I don't know, in terms of the manner in which the federal government pursues its own course in those areas. Then I think the challenge will be to not overly securitize those issue sets. I'm inclined to think they may not do that because I don't think they want that either exactly. So I'm not sure how they, other than be as glancing as possible in their mention, which would signal a de-emphasis, period. I'm not sure how they address it other than saying things like, where it comes to issues of weapons of mass destruction or some other security issue emanating or a counter-terrorist issue emanating where we feel the need to become involved, we are by and large going to make this a secondary issue for the United States. Now, my personal coda to that is every time we've done that, it bites us. In
We
the
may not be
nether
interested
regions,
in failed
yes,
states,
but
but
failed states become
interested
interested in us. But again, it is not terribly unusual for us to learn that lesson the hard way, and I think some may even, in a calculated way, think, it's better to be penny wise, pound foolish. But, at least you're penny wise for the 4 years before you have to face re-election. So it's not, from my perspective, not the right way to do it, but that might be the way they work their way through the problem.
Let me just reflect. So first, I love the term securitize because in a past life in the finance world, that has a whole other word. But I know it's true. There's different terms. So you're absolutely right. It is securitize or militarize the situation. I do think that it's not clear to me that the Trump administration actually believes their own budget that they put forward. They put forward a skinny budget, this so-called skinny budget on sort of the F1, I'm just thinking about the state and aid and the non-kinetic stuff, and it was a 30% cut. And 6 weeks later, they put forward, and in that budget, as part of that, they said, we're going to zero out OPIC. And then they named two very excellent, very high caliber people to run OPIC 6 weeks later. So the people who would take that job and raise their hands saying, I've got this wonderful role for you. I want you to go through this miserable 9-month Senate confirmation process and then fire 200 people. You up for that? So I actually not sure they actually believe in their own budget. So I think it'll be very interesting to see how this all plays out. So I think that'll be interesting to watch. Okay, Christine, so issue of failed, fragile, weak states, when you hear that term, what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of see that coming out of the Defense Department, to pick up on the over-securitizing theme, as, the counterterrorism approach. So they'll have to lay out their theory of the case for counterterrorism in this document. And I think, the Obama administration had sort of a multi-spectrum approach to it that certainly had a kinetic piece to it. We had, drone strikes that we were trying to put on a more sustainable footing. We were working with countries like Iraq to build up their forces on the ground, working with countries like Afghanistan, for example. But we also, the Obama administration also had placed a lot of emphasis on trying to deal with root causes, a lot of the development pieces, and also trying to deal with countering violent extremism. And I think, we sort of saw a multi-dimensional solution was the strategy, really. And again, I think the question here is going to be, what is this new administration going to do? Certainly their budget, would indicate they are not going to emphasize those kinds of approaches. And it's true, they could point to the private sector, and charitable organizations, and even other countries. I think the challenge this administration is going to have, given the kind of water that's already under the bridge in the first several months, is there going to be goodwill on the part of our allies and friends to step up to that and be part of that? And, I think when we're sending a fair amount of certainly what sound to me like mixed messages to some of our closest allies and friends, it's not obvious to me necessarily that goodwill will be there or for how long. So I really think, again, I think I said at the outset, I think the authors of this strategy have a really tough job. They don't have a lot of source material. What they have is pretty strategically incoherent. And trying to mix that up into something that's going to hold up to scrutiny and make sense is a really tall order.
So Tony, you were the coordinator for all assistance in Afghanistan. So you bring that perspective, and then you were ambassador to Mexico. Mexico has many wonderful things about it. It's have made incredible economic progress. There's a lot of great things about Mexico. There's also some challenges Mexico has. So my classification of sort of countries going the way of South Korea and countries that are purely fragile is an oversimplification in the case of Mexico. So if you were advising the writers of the national security strategy and you were thinking about this issue of fragility, conflict-affected countries, what would be some of the advice you'd give them?
Well, first, I think I'd say that you do need to set some priorities and categories for where you get involved. There are some places we're already involved and we're not going to get out of anytime soon, and that's Iraq and Afghanistan, the big ones, and then Syria and part of Iraq with ISIS. We're going to have to be involved in those places. There are other places where we have different kinds of involvement. There are humanitarian crises where we might take care of the humanitarian needs but not address with any heavy resources the other needs in that area. We might
like a Haiti, for example,
or South Sudan, or other things. We may try and save the starving people, but not want to get too heavily involved in correcting the political problems there. There are other places where we need careful watching brief to say when they may explode onto a region and may explode in a way that we're going to have to get involved and try and head that off. So we want a process that is robust to assess watch situations and then make recommendations on how we get involved or not get involved in that situations. And then we have, in the case of Mexico, in the case of others, we have states that have a lot of very good points to them, but have points of fragility. And in those cases, what we've learned and developed most successfully seems to be to develop long-term partnerships in plans developed and led by those countries, the most outstanding example being Plan Colombia and Colombia, where we've been there a long time, and they've been working on this a long time, and finally they're getting to a point where the civil war part of it is ending. The drug trafficking part of it is not ending. There's still all sorts of cocaine coming out of there. But then you can now start working on that maybe in a different light. Similarly with Mexico, we started our serious work with them with the MERITA program in 2008. We've gone through a number of steps in that evolving partnership. It probably will evolve somewhat further in the next couple of years, depending on what this administration does, but it has had good results, and at the same time, there are places that still need additional attention. And you need a specific country reflection and strategy to figure out what would be the best steps.
Thanks. All right, let's talk about opportunities. I think the world has changed even from 5 or 10 years ago. Tony, you were talking about, let me start with you, Tony, about opportunities. Would you just share a little bit the anecdote you shared at lunch about when you were Economic Affairs Secretary on the issue of energy? Let me start with energy, because I think the energy conversation is a different conversation, and I think it's an absolute opportunity for the United States. Tony.
I was commenting that when I left being Assistant Secretary for Economic Business Affairs in 2006, we were still worried about running out of oil and being dependent on other countries. And we're now in a situation, because of technology and fracking, where we are an oil supplier. And in North America, we now have the potential to not far potential, a near-term potential to be a real energy power in the world if we can get this cooperation going throughout North America. That changes your dependence on other parts of the world. Now, it doesn't change everything. The Middle East is still a big supplier to a lot of other countries. But it changes the perspective from which, the basis from which we might intervene politically in the Middle East on different problems, or that we might build partnerships with others. We could now be a supplier of necessity for Western Europe, for example, in the energy area.
So instead of the Russians, for example.
Instead of being so dependent on the Russians, we, in a situation of dire need, could perhaps help them out. That changes the calculus. In the negotiation of NAFTA, we are now exporters. We have a surplus in the energy area with Mexico. And that surplus is likely to grow as they buy more natural gas and more refined gasoline from us. That changes, even from the perspective of measuring a deficit, or if we have a deficit, that's going to change. So that changes your calculus in just how you look at this strategic situation. Having all that inexpensive gas makes our manufacturing sector much more competitive. The plastic sector, aluminum production in the United States is a lot cheaper because we have that natural gas coming from out of the fracking and the new technology. So a lot of things have changed over the past 10 years in that one sector, which have implications for our national security.
Christine, when you think about opportunities, what are some of the things when you think that are not negative, but what are some positives on the positive side of the ledger?
Yeah, I think it's entirely possible we might see in this administration's NSS an emphasis on innovation as sort of an opportunity. I think, there's a tremendous amount of innovation in our country. Atlantic Council did actually a report looking at Silicon Valley, Austin, Texas, Madison, Wisconsin, and there was a fourth city that is escaping me, really looking at, why are these places power centers of innovation? What makes them that way? How do we nurture that around the country? And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think the White House has set up sort of an innovation office, and I think that's something that they probably see as an opportunity area that I think really is one, and I would expect to see some treatment of that. I also think regionally, Asia is a really important opportunity for the United States. And what I've tried that was obviously an emphasis area for the Obama administration, and I've kind of quietly said to folks I know in the Trump administration, rebrand it, call it what you want, don't call it the pivot, don't call it the rebalance, but just keep the content, keep building the relationships with countries.
The swivel to Asia.
Right. But even if they don't call it anything, keep building those relationships with Vietnam, with India. And you saw, Modi was just here with Malaysia, with Singapore. I think that there's just tremendous opportunity for the United States and the region, culturally, economically, diplomatically, and I hope that work continues.
Kath, so what are our opportunities?
Well, I agree with Christine's focus on innovation. I think that's a big one, and not only is there an office, it's led by Jared Kushner, so I think there's a strong chance that they'll want to highlight innovation. I'd love to come back on the energy issue, but won't do it now. On other areas, I would just highlight the opportunities for growing standard of living, opportunities for increasing health. I think there's a lot there in poverty reduction, frankly, and in improving health, education, and living standards in the world. I think urbanization intersects this, which has opportunity and risks. associated with it, but I think there are opportunities that urbanization creates. I think there's opportunities in food, if we can get a distribution system set. And some of these do intersect climate, which again, I think, and there are opportunities and threats, I suppose, there. But there are opportunities in terms of global interest in efforts that, generally speaking, in the Western democracies at least, that would tend toward helping raise standard of living and improve lifestyle for many people in the developing world.
Yeah, I do think those are certainly opportunities. I think about urbanization. It's something like 60% of the world now lives in cities. It's going to go to 75%. I think in Africa, I think it's now north of 50% and it's growing. Most of the urbanization is going to be in places you've never heard of, with names of cities you've never heard of. So there's lots of those folks, when they move from a rural area to an urban area, they buy more food in grocery stores, they use financial services, they use cars, they get mortgages, and so hopefully they'll buy a lot of that from American companies, and there's a lot of infrastructure that goes into it too, and they use a lot more water, power, and in general. I do think that's right. I do think there are lots of opportunities I think to the extent that countries develop, they'll buy our stuff. They're not gonna, they'll burden share. That's what South Korea buys our stuff. They have a foreign aid program. They're a military ally, and they help us solve global problems, whether it's Ebola or something else. I do think, I wouldn't be surprised if, I hope there's some language about development and sort of the opportunities there, because there are opportunities and there's a role in it. And to the extent that we think about enlightened self-interest, I just did an article in foreignpolicy.com talking about the 70th anniversary of the Marshall Plan, and we did the Marshall Plan not necessarily out of the goodness of our hearts, though that was a part of it. It was because communism was a real threat and we were going to lose Western Europe. And also we had learned a really bad lesson from World War I, where we were too harsh in the victory on the defeated, and it created all sorts of resentments. And so we learned a really hard lesson. So this was not necessarily about it. We get all sorts of credit, and isn't it wonderful and out of the goodness of our hearts? But that is not why we did it. And so I think development and foreign assistance is about enlightened self-interest. And I think Mattis is the one General Mattis said, okay, if you're going to cut the foreign assistance budget, then you need to give me a larger budget so I can buy more bullets. So it's a risk management tool, and it's about helping and supporting our friends and undercutting our adversaries. And we got a lot of friends in the world, and I also think the other thing is it's a little bit of a threat and a little bit of opportunity. I think the issue of China, I think is what I say to governments and policymakers, as I said, that China is a credible soft power competitor today. So if we don't meet the hopes and aspirations of developing countries, they don't have to wait around. They can take their business to the Chinese. It's as simple as that. I mean, I think it's very so. So threats and opportunities we've talked about. I want to get to one other thing. But Tony, do you have a comment you want to make?
Just to build on that, so I would hope that this new national security strategy looks at the opportunities, looks at the possibilities for offense for our interests, in the sense of, let me talk about it from the trade perspective. There are a lot of markets out there that we can expand, that we can develop, not just the developing countries, but some of the developed countries. And there are a lot of places where companies can use our help overseas to keep those markets open, to create new markets. So I hope we will see built into this that kind of opportunity-seeking agenda, not just the risk management and defensive agenda. That's how we're going to help sustain and maintain prosperity as we go forward, is taking advantage of those international opportunities, as well as making our own economy more competitive with more R&D, with better education, with better workforce development, and all the other steps that need to be taken.
Okay, let me just, I think there's going to be some, I don't wish it, and this isn't a wish, this is just a description of, I think, of a fact. Because of urbanization, because of increasing airplane travel, and because of the changes in diets as we move to, there's a global middle class, and so as people move up on the income curve, they want more meat and dairy, so there's a lot more animal husbandry, so there's a much higher probability of zoonotic transfer of diseases, so diseases jumping from animals to people. So there's all sorts of funny named diseases that are, we have a risk, it's like clockwork now, every 3 years there's some funny named disease that there's a pandemic. And so I think, I don't wish it, but sometime in the Trump administration, there will be some awful threat from the pandemics, and that will be a wake-up call. And it'll be about how we work with our allies, how we use foreign assistance, how we use diplomacy, how we use security, and I think it's going to be, and so I think that is, for sure, some sort of black swan like a pandemic is going to be there. I also think linking issues of unplanned migration, however you want to call it, with push factors and how we can deal with that. I think you're going to, I wouldn't be surprised if, getting a better understanding of what's happening in the Northern Triangle will have lessons not only in other parts of the Western Hemisphere, but also in other parts of the world. And I think that there'll be a realization that it's in our enlightened self-interest to be thinking about how do we help the countries prosper, have better governance, better citizen security, not because it's a feel-good thing to do, but it's in our own enlightened self-interest. I want to take advantage of this panel and ask one further question. I want to use the word trade. How do you expect the word trade to come up in this strategy?
You have to start with a defense person. I think economic security and prosperity will definitely show up. I think probably prosperity it's the most frequently used frame. It is a frame that was used glancingly in the McMaster-Cohn piece, which I do really believe was a trial run of themes of the national security strategy. So I think framed around prosperity, trade will be put in this sort of self-interested, where trade advances U.S. interests, to be defined later where that is. The United States is in favor of trade. I think the problem is squaring the circle to Christine's point about, how do you make something of this, is how to make that look as anything other than just a completely selfish transactional, not thinking about, how it helps grow a common community of trading nations, so that you're growing some kind. As a matter of fact, that article rejects the term global community. I think for many of our potential trading partners, they do have, if you will, a values-based piece of course, they're self-interested, but it is also coming from a values-based perspective, and I think it dampens their interest if they think either we are out to get the best out of them, and screw them, if you will, get a better deal because we think they've been screwing us. Yes, sorry, I think that moves into PG territory, but we're still well in the family realm.
The family think tank.
But I do, so that's how I would expect it to come in. I would be very surprised, but it's possible they will directly hit, and I'll defer to Tony on NAFTA, but issues like NAFTA, issues like TPP, or even the U.S.-European transatlantic trade. I think it'll be more of a generalized comment on trade has a role in our prosperity, but it has to be trade the way we want it.
Okay. Christine, you just comment on the
As
word
another
trade.
former defense person, I will just defer to the diplomat to my left.
You cede your time to the diplomat. Okay, Tony, so if you hear the word trade, what would you hope to see in it, and what do you expect to see in it when I say that term?
I will be very happy to see general language talking about trade and prosperity, because I think the understanding of an effective trade policy will evolve as this administration starts dealing with its partners around the world and its own businesses and our economic interests. And I think that's good. That will be healthy. So I think a section that clearly recognizes that a lot of America's prosperity and well-being in the future depends on good trade and investment relationships with its allies and partners, with others in the world, and with potential future markets is a sufficient guideline to take this forward.
Just one more second since we have you. So Tony, on NAFTA, there's been a lot of public criticism by the president on NAFTA. Would you expect any language at all on NAFTA? And just briefly, what are your hopes for the future of NAFTA?
Well, I don't think there'd be, unless there's already an agreement by the time this comes out. Now, the goal, the best possible scenario would be that they've reached agreement by the end of this year.
On sort of adjustments to NAFTA.
With adjustments, with a modernization, as it's called.
Modernization NAFTA.
And I think that is the optimal scenario, that there is a modernization of NAFTA that incorporates a number of the things that were talked about in the TPP context, but incorporates it in a North American setting that deals with some of the irritants on both sides, on all three sides, both sides. But that's not necessarily what will happen. I think that this has a real opportunity to be a win-win, but that's not surprising for me to say, having been ambassador to Mexico and former Assistant Secretary for Economic and Business Affairs. I do think it has been a win-win situation. And I think one of the themes that I hope to see come out of this relates to R&D and technology, and the fact that about 85% of the job losses we've had in the manufacturing sector have been due to technology and to productivity improvements and automation. And there is a real agenda in North America for training our workforce, developing our workforce for the new technologies that we know are coming down the line, so people can maintain jobs, can adapt their jobs, can find good employment when the technology brings radical changes over the years ahead. And I think there's a space for a public-private academic initiative in North America to help create those new jobs.
Great. Yeah, that implies a little bit about the fourth industrial revolution, which hasn't come yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if there isn't some language about whatever you want to call it, the second machine age or the fourth industrial revolution. Driverless cars, AI, virtual reality, big data, drones, robots, miniaturization, advanced manufacturing, advanced materials. There is a big disruptive force coming to all of this that Tony's alluding to. Okay, you've all been patient. I want to call on 2 or 3 people. We're going to bunch some questions together. That gentleman in the back with the great yellow tie, this young woman here with the blue shirt, and then a third person, and then this gentleman here. I'm going to do these 3. So this gentleman, this woman in the blue shirt, and then this gentleman here. Yeah.
Hi, Rob Levinson from Bloomberg Government. Kathleen started out and she talked about the continuity between 16 national security strategies. And I'm just questioning, we're all sort of still talking about the assumption that the next national security strategy is still going to have a lot of that continuity, that the adults in the room, the Mattis and the McMaster are going to, pull things back, and this has been the assumption. But we've seen this administration, they pulled out a TPP, which you probably couldn't find 2 people in this room before that happened who thought that was a good idea, pulled out of the Paris Agreement. What are the chances that this won't reflect continuity, that we will see some major departures from what we've all thought as the sort of post-Cold War, post-World War II consensus on American foreign policy?
Okay, this woman here in the blue shirt.
Hi, good afternoon. Melanie Stanish from Control Risks. And actually, my question's a little bit related to what you just asked, but you brought up a couple of issues around, contradictory decisions regarding national security, mixed messages to allies. Really, at the end of the day, where does this national security policy going to stand in the long term when today we're watching Twitter to see where we're going as far as the direction is for our security policy? I mean, how relevant is this document truly going to be? Is this just a nice thought exercise, or is this really going to
It's just going to sit on the shelf.
Yeah.
Okay.
How's it going? My name is Peter. I'm an intern at the House of Foreign Affairs Committee. My question relates to Afghanistan, and seeing how that we have been there for 16 years. Trump wants to emphasize sending another 4,000, and maybe later on developments according to the Pentagon kind of give them more freedom. But seeing how we have been there 16 years, is this war winnable at this point? And secondly, if he's going to define a strategy, how is sending 4,000 more troops any different, or how can that impact the mission there compared to when we had the surge in Afghanistan, transitioning from Iraq to Afghanistan? And if that didn't work, what is the plan going forward?
Yeah, that's a happy question. Thank you for that. So let's take those 3 questions. To ask people to just respond to each and just go down the line. Yeah.
Well, just to be clear, Dan set me up by saying not what I thought would happen at first, but what I hoped would happen. And as a bona fide member of the bipartisan national security establishment, I very much hope, as an internationalist, that we will have an articulation of a continued emphasis on the U.S. role in the world. That is not the same as, do I think it's what's good? I think you will have a break in continuity. And again, I would point back to that article where there is this very confused attempt to bring the establishment community along with language that they're are used to seeing vital interests, international, we will lead, with this strange to us, sort of very particular Trumpian twist. I think the big question in the storming and norming process that develops this strategy, and this gets to the second question, is how, at least in this one instance, even if it's just a pitched battle at one point in the administration as opposed to a resolution of an internal war over what their security strategy is, how does that get resolved? Who does the resolving, and to what degree does the president even get behind whatever gets articulated? Does he sign the foreword? Most presidents sign the foreword of the national security strategy. They don't have to, right? He could say, you know what, H.R. McMaster, sign this thing out. I'm not really interested in it. Or he could say, this is what I want you to say, and this is how I'm going to say it, and I'm putting my name to it. These things matter in terms of how important the strategy is, what it tells others about our process, our system, and our principles and interests in terms of the strategy. I would not be at all surprised if you saw significant breaks in continuity. I think trade and immigration are two areas where you'll see big shifts. I think the emphasis on strength at home is where you'll see continuity from where the Obama administration sort of last articulated a national security strategy, because I think that's a continuing domestic interest for the United States. You see the population, the electorate responding to that. And I think the big question marks are exactly how they talk about alliances, how they talk about the way in which we conceive of trade and other international agreements and relationships, multilateralism in general.
Let me just jump in, and thank you, Kath, for that. Let me just address this. I'm going to take my moderator off for a second, just to address this. Let me offer an alternative view, which is I think that I was not pleased with the op-ed, and I had some concerns about the Cohn-McMaster op-ed, but I would say, let me try something else and say that on issues like burden sharing, I think that's been a constant of asking allies to burden share over many administrations. It just may be less politically correct how it's being described, but I'd say, okay, they're not necessarily that far off. They just are not saying it in a very nice way. Second, in terms of international norms, I think, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, I think the Syria bombing, there was some specific discussion about either human rights or some kind of international norms around that. The return to Cuba sanctions, there was language about human rights. They've rolled out the annual report on trafficking in persons. I believe Secretary Tillerson actually participated in that. So that would say to me that, so if I say burden sharing, that's a constant. International norms, okay, there's maybe a significant de-emphasis, but a break, I wouldn't agree with. In terms of trade, I lament and disagree very strongly with the issue of the ending of TPP. I regret that very much. I think there have been other adjustments to NAFTA. I believe there was 8 adjustments since 1993. So a modernization of NAFTA is not outside of the realm. And in my next life, I want to be a owner of Canadian, is it softwood lumber? Is that what the thing is? And so in my next life, I'm going to be, when you look up crony capitalist, you look up softwood lumber owner. That's what a crony capitalist, that's the definition. So on trade, I lament the ending of TPP. I hope we don't end TTIP. I'd like them to finish the job on the WTO trade facilitation agreement, but are they exiting the WTO? No, they're not doing that. Have they exited NAFTA? No, they didn't. Was there some noise about that? Would that have been a really stupid thing? That would have been a colossally stupid thing, but they're not doing that. So then in terms of military spending, I think I'm okay with them spending more money on the military. Is that so then I'd say finally on allies, he's had a whole series of allies come through the door. So I would just say, I think it's true there's a de-emphasis, but a break is too strong of a word. Are they exiting the liberal international order? No, I do not believe they're exiting the liberal international order. Do they want to perhaps renegotiate what the terms are for the United States to be engaged in the liberal international order? That is possible. Do I think they're doing it in perhaps the most politically correct or diplomatic way? No, I don't. But I think it's too far to say, to your point about the word break, I would disagree with that and just take issue with that. But I think that I'll stop there. Christine.
I do think that there's likely to be, I guess the way I would put it is I think given the Cohn-McMaster op-ed, I think you might see at least a 30% differential of content with this administration versus previous ones. And I think it starts with their fundamental, or at least, again, hopefully if that was a trial balloon and it got enough negative reaction, maybe they'll try to walk away from it a little bit. But I was struck by, frankly, the rejection of the idea of an international community and the entire kind of post-World War II Western community that we have been so instrumental in building and leading. And instead, this depiction of, it's sort of a dog-eat-dog world where every, nation is out for itself and we'll work with you when our interests align, but, there's nothing more durable than just kind of a transactional approach. That, to me, is a very different way of framing the world and how we see it compared to how we have traditionally seen it as swamp creatures. On the durability, I think that's a great point, and I don't know where they're going to land on that, because on the one hand, I think actually, if you look past the tweets and if you look past some of the major things that have happened, there is a lot of continuity. On the NATO front, for example, we are continuing to do the European Reassurance Initiative. We're continuing to do a lot with Asia. We are staying in Afghanistan and all of that. So one could make the argument that, in fact, regardless of the package that it's wrapped in, there's a lot of sustainable content. On the other hand, I think it is worth noting that, and you see this now, I think, around the healthcare debate, and you've seen it in other venues, President Trump is a deal maker, and he's used to negotiating sort of standalone, one-off real estate deals where he needs to maximize his flexibility and his freedom of movement, and he likes to keep his options open. And I think that's kind of his personal ethos, and in that I can see him potentially not wanting to pin down some of these tensions that are there. I think the folks like Secretary Mattis, General McMaster, Secretary Kelly, Secretary Tillerson are going to be trying to make the argument that, hey, we actually need to have consistency in our foreign policy, and you can't always kind of have that maximum maneuvering room. So I think they'll try to make that argument as trying to say, look, that's why it's important that we kind of lock down some of these key positions. But who wins that debate remains to be seen. I do just want to make a couple comments about Afghanistan. I think the key issue, there are some things I think that have changed that give me a little more confidence that what is really an incremental plus up in the number of troops could still be valuable and could give DoD some more space to work with the Afghan National Security Forces. I don't think you necessarily need a whole additional 20,000. I think the key issue really is this administration going to come out and very clearly say, this is why Afghanistan is in our national security interests. This is why we need to stay there, and we need to stay there for the long term, for however long it takes to defeat the Taliban and to build, a sustainable, a nation that can stay on its own. And I think, because we have not done that, because we've had a time-based kind of calendar, we've allowed the Taliban to hedge, as opposed to seeing it in a more permanent way, like our presence on the Korean Peninsula, for example. So if that's where the administration is going to come out, maybe what they appear to be doing there has potential. But I think that, to me, is not yet clear.
Well, I agree with what my colleagues have said. Let me just take up a little bit on Afghanistan, since I spent some time there. I think first it is important that we have a decision and a clear vision on why we're there. And it seems to me that at very base, that is not having an open space, which again can be used for an attack against us and other allies or other key places around the world from radical extremists. I don't think that would necessarily be the Taliban, but it would be ISIS and, as it was, Al-Qaeda that was there before. So if you can get agreement on that, then actually, staying 15, 16 years is a long time, but how long have we been in South Korea? And if you look 15 years into South Korea, they still had a military dictatorship in the mid-1960s, and we'd spent a lot of time with 50,000 troops or more defending them. It's turned out to be a worthwhile long-term investment for us, for them. So the time in and of itself isn't the only determinant. It's really what's in our national interest. And then do we have a prospect of getting to the place, not where we have a Denmark, in Afghanistan, but where we have a stable government that can maintain control over its territory, hopefully with as many good practices as possible. But we aren't building a modern state in that sense. We're building a stable situation because the root of it is because it's in our national security interest to do that. The secondary benefits are we're helping a lot of, Afghans who want their nation to be a better place than it is today. And if we're going to do that, it's not just about these 4,000 troops either. We're going to have a more effective set of development and governance interventions. We're going to have a more effective set of partners there in Afghanistan who deliver on the reforms they've promised to deliver. And we're going to have friends and allies willing to be there in a sustained way with us, which goes back to all the other comments of my colleagues about treating the allies and partners with enough respect that they want to remain our partners and allies in tough places like Afghanistan.
Yeah, we need our friends and allies, and our friends need to feel that they're being treated with respect.
Right.
Right.
And as of now, they're still there with us. A lot of them are still there in Afghanistan. They don't have to be. They've chosen to be part of that partnership because they share this strategic vision, and they are willing to continue that partnership with us.
Okay, we're running out of time, but I want to give Kath Hicks the last word.
I want to thank you, Dan, for putting this panel on, and it's always good to try to be constructive and help those who are out there, we know, kind of toiling through writing these documents, but also to people who are going to end up reading it, what they should be looking for. And I just want to add again, I think the things you're going to be looking for is there a continued articulation of a desire for U.S. leadership? Is the president going to get himself squarely behind this document? And if not, how do we interpret that? And where are sort of priorities set? Where are bullets dodged? There's a lot to read in what you don't read. What are priorities, what aren't? But at the end of the day, it's a document, and it can be overtaken by events and other documents, so we should just put it in context.
Please join me in thanking the panel.